Thank you. Appreciate that. Before we begin, we have a poll. And so Bethany, why don't you introduce our poll for us?
Yes, there it is. Let me launch it. So we would like to get to know a little bit about your role, your primary role at your institution while we do the session for you today. So if you want to go ahead and answer that poll, and we will start introducing ourselves while you are doing that. So I'll start. I am Bethany Schultz. I have been at Northwest Nazarene University for the last 11 years, and I've always had a role with instructional design or instructional technology in some capacity since I have been here, but I'm currently the director of instructional design and technology. Crystal?
So I am Christa Nielsen, and I'm the instructional designer and technologist. I've been at Northwest Nazarene University since 2004, except for 4 years at Boise State. And I was the Northwest eLearn chair 10 years ago, maybe. So anyway, welcome.
And I am Christa Sandidge, and I'm the director of the Center for Professional Development. So I have a variety of different areas that I involved in. And so I was really delighted to be a part of this team that kind of ventured into these instructional design spaces. And so let's go ahead and get started. Thanks to you who have responded in our poll. Appreciate that. And Bethany, if you go ahead and advance our slide there. There we go. Thank you. So today we're looking at this topic of how to do discussions according to students. And discussion boards, we know, are foundational, and they're a foundational element to every online class. And so if you've taught or if you've taken online classes, you've experienced and assigned discussion boards. So there's part of what we do when we are teaching and learning online. So before we kind of dive into the whole meat of our content, we would like to ask you, why do you use discussion boards? So please go ahead and open up your chat down at the bottom there. You can click the chat button and it should open up in the column on the side there. And just kind of start putting in your thoughts. Why do you use discussion boards and what are you wanting to achieve with them? You can see those questions there. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, creating community. What else? Connection, student to student. Oh, they're coming so fast. So good. Diversity of ideas, students to learn from each other. Yeah, really that social presence is an important part of that. Student to student connection. Okay. And oh, here's something. I've chosen to discontinue them. They're available for peer-to-peer without grading. Building student knowledge via social collaborative approach. Nice, good, thank you. So many good answers here. Teachable moments that can benefit everyone. Easier for asynchronous approach. Recreate my face-to-face classes as much as possible. These are, yes, all the reasons why we choose to use and incorporate discussion boards. And this is what we find for our own classes and the classes that had been happening here on campus. So Bethany, let me turn it over to you now.
So just to set the stage of where we came up with this topic and why we are passionate about it now, I don't think any of us could say that we were really passionate about discussion boards prior to this experience. But we, the three of us, were assigned to create mandatory training for faculty last summer in order to improve on our remote teaching skills. And in that process, we interviewed students and we also read through course evaluations to get their perspective on their remote learning experience in spring 2020. And those interviews were very open-ended. We did have a few set questions, but we weren't really digging for information about discussion boards. The discussion went where the student led it with their response. And in those course evaluations, we also were not particularly looking for discussion board responses, but they were definitely present in the students' feedback for their professors at the end of the spring. So through these interviews, we learned something very foreseeable about discussion boards, and some of you have already raised those in your response to the first question. But we also had some epiphanies that we believe can meaningfully impact our online teaching and how we frame discussion boards. And we just love that it was from our students that these things came about and what they find satisfaction in when it comes to online discussion boards.
So one of our goals as faculty is to create student engagement and learning, and we one of those ways that we do that is through discussion boards. What is a traditional approach to discussions? Typically, students submit an initial post in response to a prompt or a reading, and sometimes you have a minimum word count, and then they respond to one or two other students' posts. And usually our goal is for students to think critically about the content and then hold a rich conversation online with their peers. So for the foreseeable that we gathered through our interviews, we learned that that traditional discussion boards were not creating engagement, interaction, or learning, and at least not well. If you've been a student in an online class and participated in discussion boards, it's probably not surprising to you. If you have assigned discussion boards to students and seen the lackluster engagement, it probably doesn't surprise you either.
And so today we have two goals for us. We will be sharing with you two reasons why, according to our students, discussion boards failed to meet the mark, or why they did not create engagement and learning. And then we'll also share with you two ideas, these epiphanies, or maybe some innovative ways to frame discussion boards in an online context that we think have potential to be more effective than the traditional discussion boards. And so we are going to frame those for you today, including some strategies that we think are very practical and easy to implement, that just slightly reframe how an online discussion board can be structured in order to bring out that engagement and interaction and deeper learning for our students. Christa, I think you're muted.
I am, yes. Zoom promptly informed me. Are you trying to talk? Because it's not working. So one of our clear takeaways from our student interviews was that they found traditional discussion boards to be artificial. And so why didn't they like them? And maybe even why do faculty not like them? Is the artificialness. We're trying to replicate an in-class discussion, and it was not happening. And so some of our student quotes. So the students explained that traditional discussion boards didn't feel like an in-class discussion, and they saw them as pointless. They didn't help their learning. One student said, and I quote, "I don't like them. I just throw a bunch of junk out there to meet the word count. I dread doing them. I don't get a lot out of them," end quote. And another student said, as you can read right here on the slide, "It all seems very artificial. You have to meet a quota. It's not a genuine discussion." And these items are some of those things we talk about as foreseeable. Another student noted that he did not feel interested engaging in the discussions because he believed it unlikely that his classmates really cared to dig deep. He said, "The others will not necessarily respond or answer to the questions. There's no back and forth. There's no give and take." Interesting, another student commented on how he disliked having to post before he could see other students' posts, because this actually created an even more artificial discussion. In an in-class discussion, you get to hear from your peers first. Posting first wasn't a discussion. We had a student say it was like, I mean, how often do you come into a classroom and have to give a 300-word recitation on what you have read? So most students recounting their traditional discussion board experiences bemoaned them as inauthentic. And the online discussion did not replicate or match what they had experienced in the classroom.
Sorry, that was me. So you can read this other quote that we came across, that another student, wow, having a tough day here. traditional discussions can be repetitive. One student said he wouldn't expect the professor wouldn't expect the student to come into a classroom and give a 200 to 500 word monologue about the reading. Another one said, discussions became more of an assignment than a way to engage with the material in my classmates. So even if you, as the instructor, have a deep and rich and robust prompt, you still get similar posts and replies from the students. If you're trying to create that student interaction, the discussion board is just not the place for a monologue. So one student told us, when you all read the same thing, it's hard to come up with new content to motivate the discussion. So even if those students' posts do reflect critical thinking, when everybody is writing about the same thing, it just gets repetitive. That stifles the interaction and engagement.
So given these responses from the students, the three of us, we had to reflect about what is the value in discussion boards. And even as an instructor, I would usually have a couple students who really engaged with discussion boards, but there's always a few that don't seem engaged. And it is just another thing to check off on their list of assignments. So we really thought critically about what is the value of discussion boards. And we found when we reviewed our notes from the interviews and in those course evaluations that students did really find value in the discussion boards. They saw that there was a place and purpose for class discussions. Remember, these students were an in-class experience and then were moved remotely. And so they were comparing their in-class discussions with how those discussions transferred online. And they really did want to interact with their peers. Some did find that their discussion boards fostered engagement, interaction, and learning. They were not all bad reviews about discussion boards. As one student had told us, and quote, I really loved the transition of our typical in-class discussions to online discussions. I felt that more people were able to participate that way. Rather than 5 people carrying the weight of the discussion in class, a required online discussion allowed and even forced all 40 students to participate and add their valuable insight. So what we found was that students really did find value in them. And from that, we found that some students maybe had a different structure in their discussion board that added that value for them. So we did find that our students recognized the importance and the role of in-class discussions, and they really did want that interaction with their peers. So now we're going to turn it back to you guys again to discuss. So kind of what we caught from students with that artificialness and the repetitiveness is that they were comparing that to their in-class discussions. And so what we'd like to ask you is what happens in a natural in-person discussion, either in a classroom or just in general, that is missing in an online discussion, and maybe with some intentionality, it can be in there. But what happens naturally in an in-person discussion that seems to be missing in some of those traditional discussion board experiences? So you can write in the chat. If you do want to talk, you are welcome to raise your hand. And
do send it to all panelists and attendees.
Yes. So natural ebb and flow, like that one student said, there's no give and take back and forth. Timely responses and question. A lot of students save their questions for when they come to class to ask. Nodding and eye contact. Yep, absolutely. And body language, that is the number one thing. You lose a lot of those visual cues for discussions. Wait until the due date of post. And if you were, your students are like me, when I was in my graduate and doctoral programs that were online, I do my post and my replies all in one sitting. So I didn't naturally come back to the discussion if I had already checked it off. Yeah, small responses are really shallow kind of great post kind of things, not really getting deep into a discussion. Talk aloud, natural personal experiences come up more naturally. So synchronous versus asynchronous. So yeah, we certainly had students who their professors moved to a video conference platform and they had their live discussions, not in person, but live. And we definitely saw some of these repetitiveness and artificial responses come out for the traditional discussion board versus having a live class discussion online. Less reading, overwhelming. Yeah, I hate having to scroll through all of them when I'm grading and try to follow people's trains of thoughts. Yeah, so this question was really important for us to help consider how we can create the value that we find in in-person discussions, and how can we replicate that better in a traditional discussion board without just completely throwing out discussion boards. And so from that, we found a different approach.
I did notice that somebody had put laughter in the chat. I thought, yes, that is a key piece. And then also the thinking aloud. Anytime I've ever done a discussion board, I definitely don't include my think aloud spaces because it has to be polished in a discussion board. So here you can see these two themes that from the student interviews and the course evaluations, we discovered that some instructors had taken an innovative approach. And what made the COVID context so intriguing was that you had instructors, professors who had literally never taught online. They didn't know what traditional looked like. They didn't know what normal looked like. And so they're just flying by the seat of their pants, doing the best they could. And from that, some really interesting ideas emerged about what people were doing that actually really worked. And so the two themes that we'll elaborate on here are students learn through asking questions, and students are more engaged as learners when given a choice. And so both of these will now elaborate on further what that meant and how that could be done well in that discussion board setting.
So here's another quote from some of our learners. So this is something that you can do with your students, is to just post some video lectures and let the students comment on that. Let's move to the next part of the quote too. It was a pretty long quote. We've mentioned this before, that students say, I'm not coming to class to show that I read. They are, I mean, in a certain sense, but not through the traditional way that we mentioned. Let's go to the next one. So here's our first strategy based on our theme of learning with questions. Provide clear opportunities for the students to ask those questions. One student said, learning is asking questions. I don't know if he was tapping into Socrates there, but he had come across something that really resonated for him. They can really dig deeper and clarify their understanding when they're asking questions. So what can this look like? Here's another strategy. Answer those questions within a timely manner. We suggest within 24 hours so that the students, I mean, all of us, when we have a question, whether you're calling your local, laundromat, dry cleaners, whatever, is my stuff ready? You want answers sooner rather than later. And so providing that feedback to their questions right away is a big, big factor in keeping them engaged. One computer science course, students knew that within 24 hours of the lecture being published, the instructor would respond to any posted questions. So that made them more motivated to watch the lecture and then ask their questions in a timely manner. Another technique is to have a designated Q&A each week so that they have a distinct time frame and it's relevant to that week's content. I know some of us typically have just a general Q&A if they have logistical questions about the homework or so on and so forth. But if you have a question form related to that week's content, it maybe provides a little bit more incentive for the students. And we did see instructors provide a weekly discussion forum that was used in that way.
So the other theme that emerged is driving engagement with student choice. So we had a number of students who they were provided options on their discussion boards or in their online discussions that they felt engaged them more and motivated them more. So if you think about an in-person discussion, it's full of choices. You as a student, you get to decide when you jump in, if you're going to add a point to somebody else's into the discussion, or you ask a question. You get to decide if you sit back and see where the discussion goes before you participate. Back to that student's response of, I get to hear what my other peers are saying in class, and I don't like that I have to post first before I can see what the rest of the class is discussing. So they get to choose if they have external knowledge that they're contributing to the discussion, and it's natural for them to make some of those even subconscious choices in an in-class discussion that if we have prescribed to them how we want the discussion structured in a traditional discussion board, sometimes those choices don't seem as available, where I would welcome a student to ask a question, but a student might not feel empowered to ask questions if I have not provided them that opportunity and that choice. So we really wanted to focus on the question about how can we provide choice to students in these discussion boards to try to drive some engagement. So this is one of our strategies, is to give students choice in readings and prompts. You can let them choose what they read or watch before they join the discussion, provide them a variety, maybe even a variety of modalities of that content so they can choose based on what they can learn best with. So instead of just having one reading assignment or one lecture, anything, and one deep open-ended prompt, maybe provide a list of reading options or multiple prompts, and students can choose what they respond to. It might surprise you how many students would read multiple things, even if they're only asked to read one, because they're trying to engage with their peers. So students who had choices in prompts expressed that it was more engaging and to have those choices because they were learning new things, and it reduced some of that repetitiveness of everybody responding to the same thing. Another strategy was to give students choice in how they interact in the discussion. So this could be giving them multiple prompts so that they could choose from, so they have some choice of what they are interacting with. But you can also, we found one professor in particular gave 3 options underneath their posted video lectures that they wanted students to have a discussion about. They could either ask a question, respond to somebody else's question, or comment on something interesting. We also saw this where they had prompts, but they could also decide just to answer each other's questions. And then the professor was there to answer any unanswered questions or to guide misconceptions if peers who were responding incorrectly. For this strategy, one student said discussions were mandatory, but you could comment on something interesting or post a question. Yes, less strenuous, but deeper learning. And I love that our students were using terms like deeper learning unprompted. And it might seem less strenuous, but if you think about in-class discussions, I don't grade my in-class discussions quite as harshly as I do my traditional discussion boards for fully online classes. And my in-person students are also doing deep learning. And so I'm okay with the students feeling like it's less strenuous as long as they are learning and getting to the outcomes that I am trying to help them reach. Strategy number 3 for student choices is give students choice in how they earn their grade. So you could provide choice for how students earn that participation grade, or maybe it's just the discussion grade that you have in your online class. And you can set a number of points for that week and then assign point values for the different types of interactions that students can have, almost gamifying some of it. For example, a professor that we saw did this. They awarded more points for original or that initial post than replies to students, but students could choose how they interacted. So in this case, the professor had about 10 to 50 points for participation or discussion available in a week, depending on the week. And then students could earn 7 points for original posts and 3 points for replies. So if they were struggling with the content and they felt more confident engaging with their questions with their peers and things with replies, they could do all replies and still earn points and demonstrate their learning through those replies. Or they could just do their original post and the replies on a 10-point week and do that if that's how they chose to engage. You can get very creative with this in lots of different ways, like point value for asking questions and not just original posts and replies, or maybe bringing in related content from outside the course and things like that. So a lot of choice for you as well as your students for how they earn that participation or that discussion grade in an online class.
So before we jump into this next discussion question, I would like to just respond to some of the chat that's been happening. I love watching that conversation that's occurring alongside over here as well. So the way back up, somebody had commented on remote versus online. And I think that one thing that we've totally learned through this whole process is that there is not one type of online teaching. There's a whole spectrum of what that looks like. And so a remote class, especially if we have virtual sessions, ends up structured really differently than a fully online class and what that requires. So these strategies that we're kind of covering here and looking at can work in either context, but they can work in that fully online space as well. And that's kind of what excited us, was that ability to take that fully online space and shift it into something that could potentially have that greater level of engagement. And then with Choic, someone also mentioned that the responses, so they use the written audio and video responses. So that's another way of providing choice, not just with the questions or the reading options. And then there was one more question regarding the how the different content options leading to how exactly was that framed, that question? Hold on, let me go back up. Can you give an example? How the interactions work when given different choices with what they read. So we had one professor that would provide 3 different articles around the same content, the same concept, and then students could choose which one they want to read, but then the prompt, the question itself, tied into that concept and linked all of it so that the students were bringing in different perspectives, because even though it was all under the same concept, 3 slightly different perspectives from each of those different articles. So it created a really more diverse discussion because of the choices in the articles. So now let's shift to our question here. In your course or courses, whether they be remote learning or fully online, how can you create better student engagement and learning through discussions? And please either post over here in the discussion in the chat, or at this point, if you would like to unmute and go ahead and share with us, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? How can you create better student engagement?
I'll go ahead and respond also to Kimberly's question about when you're giving students those options to do video, audio, or written, are you pointing them toward accessibility guidelines? I do that. I think it's important to do that. If we're modeling that in our own classes, it's important to encourage the students to do that as well.
So I see that somebody's commented on the offering options and the idea of giving different points. Awesome. What else? What else could you do? Detailed rubric for discussion for posts. Clear expectations, always super important.
I saw something about small group discussions. We did have students who gave positive feedback that some of them already had small group discussions in person and those just transferred online, which was really helpful. And others, especially like that 40-person class, was probably broken up into small groups. We did see a lot of good things with that. Detailed rubric, that's setting those expectations. Especially when you have choices, you have to be really clear on expectations and kind of normalizing those expectations across all the choices. So one doesn't seem necessarily easier or harder. They're all pretty equal.
Here's some other ideas that are coming forth too. Instructor responses to student posts, getting involved in those discussions yourselves. And I think that answering the questions and kind of some of the students had previously seen discussion boards as really like the space for statements and not questions. And so kind of that shift in thinking to like, oh, this could be a space to ask questions as well as just give your thoughts, I think was really helpful for students to see how it could be used in both ways. And then when the instructor responded as well was really helpful. Other thoughts? How can you create better student engagement and learning through your discussions?
I'm going to offer another idea that wasn't really part of our presentation, but if you want to kind of avoid the heavy grading of doing discussions, and I think rubrics are awesome, but sometimes getting in the groove of grading all of those can be tedious. If you choose to have students write one discussion at the end that says, this was the most salient thing that I learned from all these discussions. It's more of a reflection discussion post at the end, and then you can grade that one. That's one way to approach it so that you're not sitting there grading all day long.
When Ellen just posted, I wondered if you could start a Zoom discussion and then ask students to follow up in a discussion board with more prompts, engage them first and then continue. I think that's a great idea. And something that I'm considering doing in one of my online classes this fall is to add a live session that's recorded if people cannot attend because they are online, fully online students. But that could start generating some of that discussion. So even if they weren't there live to be a part of the live discussion, they still have something to bounce off of in that discussion board afterwards. And Crystal, just reference what I'm planning to do in that discussion board is, okay, we've had this live discussion or you've watched it. Now, what is kind of your key takeaway or key concept out of that discussion that you learned, just so that they can kind of summarize and reflect on their learning, but still getting some of that interaction. And easier for me to grade.
So we have a Q&A, which you can access down below, and you can pull that up if you have questions or if you have additional comments, that those can go in the chat on the side. But we'd kind of like to hear from you at this point as well.
So we have an idea of using Google Docs for small group discussion. So they add their thoughts and the professor is able to track their posts. That's a great collaborative idea and probably a resource that they can come back to if you have an exam or something that they summative with that from that discussion content.
I like the show and tell idea as well. That's a great way to get different thinking to the table.
How do you handle the always last poster issue? I have a few students that are always last to post. Maybe I have a backwards thinking about that, but I believe a lot in student autonomy, and they make choices. And just like my face-to-face students, if they choose not to come to class or join the discussion, they're probably not getting that deeper learning, and there's natural consequences to that. I would think that if you have some motivation, like choice of how they interact, that might help cross some barriers that maybe they're just really busy and they only have a certain amount of time to do it. So there's probably some good reasons for that that aren't necessarily bad student reasons, but some motivation with choice might help.
Really quickly, I put it in with Anna here. Anna, can we enable it so that participants can unmute and be able to verbally speak and not just have to chat?
Yes, I'll do that right now.
Thank you. So we're getting great questions over here. How to coordinate, connect, or co-assign discussions to other related class assignments. I think that those, I mean, yeah, how do you actually, as a curriculum designer, I think, well, what are the other assignments? How are you wanting to do that? What are the groups looking like? There's so many possibilities there. It's hard to be able to speak specifically into that without knowing, at least on my part, what that looks like. So if you want to unmute whoever posted that, we could kind of talk through that a little bit, but we have a raised hand. Go ahead, unmute and share. Oops, if you've unmuted, I think it's Graciela. We can't hear you. There you go.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure you were talking to me, actually. Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is all great. I think we've all been moving faculty and ourselves from being in person and having that close relationship with the students, then moving to discussion boards, and we've seen faculty very frustrated. And I just had a discussion. This is mostly about a course that I co-direct at OHSU with 700 students. It was impossible for us to continue to do this in person during this time, and I don't think this year we'll go back in person either. So for me, this is very useful to improve. So 700 students, we had 54, I think, faculty helping us with the online. It's an annual course, so it's kind of massive. And I actually had meetings with some faculty that were very frustrated, saying, I make comments for the students that are thoughtful, and I don't think they're even reading my stuff. And I keep getting very generic comments, and we mostly, just to make it manageable for them, we kind of track that they do the first post and then they do the 2 responses. But I like to change how we are doing it. I like Crystal's idea of having them post like a reflection on that discussion board at the end of the board discussion of that particular one. But I was wondering, what is your, kind of your wisdom of, I'm not sure how to make it better for the faculty so that they still believe in it and they want to continue to provide a service to the university, because I see that the students are not completely committed, and then but we're losing the faculty as well. I guess so. That's my question. I don't know if it's a very clear question, but.
So we briefly discussed about creating that value for students in discussion boards. And I think what you're talking about is establishing some of that value with the faculty. And it could be some changing it up. So trying the same thing over and over again, they're probably going to be just as frustrated. But having them kind of rethink about what they really want to get out of those discussions, and maybe be creative of how they can accomplish that. Obviously, if you have a large group, that's a little bit harder to manage, and there's probably still some barriers for grading and time consuming, especially if they don't have that engagement. But it's reframing the mindset about what, and kind of getting to the root of what those instructors want to get out of those discussions, what they want students to know, and then try to line up those strategies with really what they want to get out. I can imagine some classes, they don't need discussions. They probably need other ways to interact with their peers. But we have some online classes that they've done away with discussion boards, and their students are still doing deep learning. So maybe it's even a choice with the professors of how they engage their students, and maybe it doesn't include discussions. Crystal, I think, Ray, did you want to ask a question?
Okay, I don't know. Yep, I can be heard now. Okay, I didn't see the unmute. I was probably looking in the wrong place. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I did, just from the comment earlier about, well, the comment I had put. So I kind of open-ended that, but to be maybe more specific with my question of coordinating, I would say on the other side that clearly you wouldn't want to make a discussion redundant to another related topic and assignment. But I was just wondering because this is really, I have to say, in all honesty, not patronizing, it just is so much needed, and your summaries are so many good details. So that's why I really started thinking of possibilities. So I was wondering that aspect of it, along with all your other great ideas. I think I have to review for a long time, and a lot of great stuff there. I was wondering about that idea of the synergy. You know, you can do great things like all the things you've mentioned, but it made me think about how do you synergize it with the content, with other assessments? And did you come across or any thoughts on that? So that's what I guess more particular, more elaborately what my question or inquiry was.
So I have a thought on that. I thought, what about like a peer review homework assignment where the students have to read each other's and review them and, kind of critique. And then they could also do a discussion afterward to say, this is what I learned from this experience, and kind of exchange ideas that way.
Yeah, right when you were saying it, that's how I imagined it. And so, okay, it's good to have someone confirm that that might be a good idea. Like I say, I guess just like a discussion, it has to be very well kind of framed or made as an additional instead of just being redundant. But yeah, that's definitely one that I was thinking of as I was wondering what you guys were thinking about.
You know, Ray, we had some professors who had already, Bethany mentioned the established small groups. And so those were continued, even though everything had gone. And I know we've used the term remote versus online, and it ran the gamut. And I love how those lines have blurred so much more. And we find that it's much more expansive in what we feel we can do. But keeping those small groups, I think, and having discussions within small groups could also perhaps pull in what you're kind of trying to describe a little bit. How do you create that synergy, small groups leading into big groups? And because we know that students are probably much more likely to interact well if there's there's a limit, between like 5 and 10 students, perhaps be able to interact small and not just large. So that might be another way to kind of mix it up and keep that synergistic effect occurring.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a lot of possibilities. Really, I just, I guess you're supposed to think it, but this is such a overdue, but very elaborate and very well done, especially from the student perspective. You guys really hit it in all regards. So thank you for sharing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What
I have a response for Elise's question, building off of that idea of the smaller groups. We had a large enrollment course at Boise State where I want to say like about 350 student enrollments, and they broke them off into groups of about 10, I want to say. And there were 4 TAs, graduate TAs, helping to teach the course, plus the instructor. And the graduate TAs would assist during the day-to-day discussions. The instructor would only go into one group at a time at a week. You never knew when he was going to enter your group's discussion. And that's the group that he would grade for that week. And he kept a chart so that he always knew, I need to make sure I've hit all the groups, several times during the course. But that was one way to approach it so that the grading load was manageable.
we also use Canvas. And so there's a feature in the course settings in Canvas for to sort SpeedGrader by group. And you have to have it turned on before you go in and grade a discussion or before students post to a discussion board. But that helps you in SpeedGrader to just see one group at a time instead of trying to open up each of those discussion boards and grade. That has helped us with grading some faculty discussion boards last summer.
I noticed Christy responded with a thought about having roles assigned to the small groups. I think that's a really intriguing idea. And that's the thing, and that's why I'm loving reading what is being put in the chat and the questions you guys are asking, because it does seem like we're trying to open up the possibilities and really like, how can we do this differently? Because discussion boards, I mean, you go back and look at how long have those been in existence without much change? And what could we do now that really reflects the technology that's available to us, strong pedagogy that really can seek to meet that objective of student engagement and student learning. So the idea of having small groups and that rotating leader, great idea. Thank you for sharing that.
I think one of the epiphanies that we had And all of us are from online learning backgrounds. That's our strength, more so than face-to-face. And we're trained as online course designers that you can't just take a face-to-face class and plop it online and it work well. Like it's a different modality. There's different pedagogy for teaching online. And so we're so ingrained that you can't just take what we do face-to-face and put it online. And I think one of the epiphanies for us was with discussions, we lose so much of that richness from the in-class discussion by doing it the prescribed way that we are trained and taught as best practice. And so we were trying to think a little differently of like, how can we really replicate that in-person experience and that good things that come from in-person online, which I think is seems like common sense that you want students to have a rich and engaging discussion, but is really hard to do online. And so that's really where our root of our epiphany was, how can we really do this better?
Someone earlier had posted about what do you do about the late posters? In Canvas, we have something called a to-do that's on a page at the bottom of a content page. You can check a box that says, add this to the student to-dos. And in the course of our interviews with students, we learned that they rely on those quite a bit. They really want to know what's ahead for them on a given week. And so the to-dos end up on the Canvas calendar, and it's different from an actual due date. So if you set up a page with a due date or a to-do to say your first post is due here, and then the actual discussion has the due date, that also shows up in the calendar. That's one way to approach that idea that, you know, you might get late posters who just don't remember when the deadline is.
Because just a side note, of those student responses we heard, course structure was such an important takeaway as well. The discussion board comments, super key, but that was the other big kind of learning thing, you know, like they needed the rhythm, the pattern, the structure, and the understanding of, yes, very clearly what is coming. Marcia says she does use the to-do as well. Are there any other questions or comments or ideas? You can raise your hand as well, like Anna noted, or post in the Q&A space.
Marcia had posted, I think some post late because they don't want others to respond to their responses. I think that's true. And so perhaps that choice of how they interact, they can respond to others first and kind of get a sense of if their thinking is in line with what others are thinking, and that can help build some confidence for them to present their own ideas.
And kind of springboarding off of that, the idea that they could ask questions and not just post ideas or thoughts, I think really provides a little more freedom and choice as well.
Yeah, they can gain confidence, get clarification before they post what they think their response is.
I will say it was really intriguing to sit through these student interviews. Each one was like 30 to 40 minutes, and we had no expectation of what the students would say. I mean, maybe we had some hunches, but we learned so much. And so hearing from the students about what works and what doesn't work was kind of like, yeah, we asked, what are the pinch points, what are the bright spots? And it was really quite eye-opening to hear their perspectives. I really enjoyed it.
Shall we show our resources slide?
Oh, yes. I'll draw attention to the one that has a URL. This is a professor from Canada who wrote a series of articles on faculty focus about 21 ways to structure online discussion. She graciously cited a previous presentation of ours on this same topic. But she really breaks down to different types of interactions on discussion boards and strategies for those. So if you want some more ideas that deviate from the post and reply, that's an excellent resource. And if you have any questions after this presentation, you are free to contact me. My email address there is at the bottom. If you have follow-up questions or would like some other ideas or resources.
I wanted to comment on Marcia's with the situational questions. Done a lot of research lately on actual questions. You know, what makes a powerful question? What makes an engaging question? And I think that's an important starting point, is understanding, is it open-ended enough to really, yeah, not necessarily a correct answer. There are multiple answers would work in that space. I think that's a really great point. Thank you for sharing that.
And we have a saying here that if the question can be answered with specific answers, that's an assignment, not a discussion.
And David, thank you for sharing your thought as well regarding minority opinions. Excellent, excellent insight.
Perhaps you could give them a choice if they want to be devil's advocate or agree with whatever content they're reading. And so you're actually encouraging them, even if they don't agree with the opposing viewpoint, you're encouraging them to create that opposing viewpoint, which is great for critical thinking.
Thank you all for attending today.
Yeah, it was delightful to be able to share. And unless there are further questions, yes, reimagining. I like that word, Ray. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here as well. Yeah. I think, Anna, we're turning it back to you.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to our presenters, Bethany, Crystal, and Christa. Thank you so much for sharing such wonderful insights. One thing that sometimes we forget is asking the students, right? They can be our greatest allies in developing content that is engaging and that promotes learning for them. Excellent. So we get done a little bit early, but thank you everyone. We posted the links for the slides and also the feedback survey. If you could please provide your feedback for our presenters, that would be amazing. And I'm posting the slides one more time, the link to the slides. So you're welcome to download them. And everyone have a wonderful, wonderful day. And watch out for upcoming webinars.
Thanks.
Thank you.